Dear Senator Banks, I write to you today from the city of Daejeon in the Republic of Korea as one soldier of freedom to another. My name is Kim Sun-gi, and I am a 49-year-old elder, known in our Methodist tradition as a Kwanzaa, serving faithfully at Daejeon Jel Methodist Church. By day, I work as an operations support manager at a senior welfare center, caring for the elderly members of my community. By night and on weekends, I operate a small YouTube channel called Sun Patriotic TV, where approximately 7,200 subscribers join me in prayer and advocacy for our nation's future. I am, by any measure, an ordinary man living an ordinary life, in a nation that has been blessed by its friendship with the United States for more than 7 decades. Yet today I write to you about an extraordinary injustice that demands the attention of those who have fought for freedom and who continue to defend it. Senator Banks, you are a man who understands the cost of freedom. You served in the United States Navy Reserve, and when your country called, you answered. In 2014 and 2015, you took a leave of absence from the Indiana State Senate to deploy to Afghanistan during Operations Enduring Freedom and Freedom Sentinel. While you were overseas defending freedom in a distant land, your wife Amanda stepped up to serve in your place in the state Senate, continuing your work for the people of Indiana. This sacrifice, this commitment to something larger than yourself, this willingness to put your life on the line for the values you believe in, these are the qualities that give you a unique perspective on what is happening in the Republic of Korea today. A 69-year-old pastor named Jeon Kwang-Hoon has been imprisoned for 73 days as of today, March 26, 2026. He is a soldier of freedom in his own right, and he is dying in prison for the crime of speaking truth to power. This letter you now hold in your hands is the 24th international letter I have written to American leaders pleading for Pastor Jeon's release. I have written to President Trump, Vice President Vance, Secretary Rubio, Speaker Johnson, and numerous senators including Lindsey Graham, Ron Johnson, Bill Hagerty, and John Kennedy. Today I write to you, Senator Banks, because I believe that you, as a veteran who has served in combat, as a born-again evangelical Christian, who has publicly declared that Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior, as one of President Trump's closest allies in the United States Senate, and as a leader who has made holding China accountable a central focus of your work, will understand both the urgency of this situation and the strategic implications it carries for the United States and its allies in the Indo-Pacific region. Senator Banks, I address you first and foremost as one who has served in combat to one who fights for freedom in a different arena. Your deployment to Afghanistan from 2014 to 2015 was not merely a line on your resume, it was a defining chapter in your life that shaped who you are today. You left the comfort and safety of Indiana, you left your position in the state Senate, you left your wife Amanda and your family, and you went to one of the most dangerous places on earth to serve your country. You served during Operations Enduring Freedom and Freedom Sentinel, operations whose very names speak to the values you were defending. You understand that freedom is not free, that it must be defended by those willing to sacrifice, and that the enemies of freedom never rest in their efforts to extinguish it. What makes your service even more remarkable is the sacrifice your family made alongside you. When you deployed to Afghanistan, your wife Amanda did not simply wait at home. She stepped up to serve in your place in the Indiana State Senate, becoming your voice for the people of Indiana while you served your country overseas. This partnership, this shared commitment to public service, speaks volumes about the values that animate your family. You and Amanda fought for Hoosiers together, advancing pro-growth, pro-family, and pro-veteran reforms even as you were separated by thousands of miles and the dangers of a war zone. This is the kind of dedication that the Republic of Korea desperately needs from its allies today. As one of its most faithful defenders of freedom languishes in prison, Pastor Jeon Kwang-Hoon is a soldier of freedom in his own right. He has spent 50 years in ministry, preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ and shepherding congregations. But he is also a patriot who understands that faith and freedom are inseparable, that the liberties we enjoy are gifts from God, that must be defended against those who would take them away. For 7 years, from 2019 to 2026, Pastor Jeon organized weekly rallies at Gwanghwamun Square in the heart of Seoul. These were not violent protests or insurrections. They were worship services held in public, where tens of thousands of Koreans gathered to sing hymns, to pray, to recite the Lord's Prayer, and to wave Korean, American, and Japanese flags, celebrating the alliances that have kept Korea free for 70 years. Not one act of violence was initiated by Pastor Jeon or his followers in 7 years. Not one. Yet today he sits in prison, his body failing, while the president of South Korea threatens to uproot religious involvement in political life. Senator Banks, as a veteran who has faced danger in defense of freedom, I ask you to stand with Pastor Jeon, another warrior for freedom, who is now facing the greatest battle of his life. His weapons are not rifles and bullets but prayer and proclamation. His battlefield is not the mountains of Afghanistan but the public square of Seoul. But the cause is the same, the defense of liberty against those who would destroy it. I believe that your experience as a combat veteran gives you a unique ability to recognize courage when you see it, to honor sacrifice when you encounter it, and to speak out for those who cannot speak for themselves. Pastor Jeon cannot speak for himself from his prison cell. He needs soldiers of freedom like you to speak for him. Senator Banks, I am deeply moved to address you as a fellow believer in Jesus Christ. You have publicly declared that you are a born-again evangelical Christian who believes that Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior. You have stated that you believe the Bible is the inerrant Word of God and that all Christian authority can be found in the Lord's book. You have testified that your faith has led you to coordinate an interfaith Bible study for people interested in public policy and government, and that you felt called to serve your community in Congress as an expression of your faith. This public confession of faith gives me confidence that you will hear my appeal, not merely as a matter of foreign policy or political calculation but as a matter of Christian conscience and biblical obedience. I too am a Christian, serving as an elder at Daejeon Methodist Church in South Korea. Our faith traditions may differ in some particulars, but we share the same Lord, the same Savior, and the same commitment to living out our faith in the public square. The evangelical heritage that shapes your faith teaches that Christians are called not only to personal piety but also to public engagement, not only to save souls, but also to transform society, not only to worship in private but also to bear witness in public. This heritage is under direct attack in the Republic of Korea today, where the president has declared that religious involvement in politics must be completely uprooted and where pastors are being compared to armed rebels committing treason. Pastor Jeon Kwang-Hoon, though Presbyterian in his own tradition, represents this same vision of engaged Christianity. He has spent 50 years preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, calling sinners to repentance, and building the church. He rose to become the president of the Christian Council of Korea, the largest Protestant organization in the nation, representing millions of believers across thousands of churches. And when he saw his country drifting toward accommodation with communist North Korea and away from its traditional alliance with the United States, he felt called by God to speak out. His weekly rallies at Gwanghwamun Square were not political protests in any conventional sense. They were worship services held in public, where believers gathered to sing hymns, to pray, and to express their gratitude for the freedoms that the U.S. Korea alliance has protected for 7 decades. Senator Banks, when President Lee Jae-myung declares that religious involvement in politics must be completely uprooted, he is attacking the very foundation of evangelical Christian engagement with society. He is saying that believers must stay silent while the government pursues policies that violate our values. He is saying that faith has no place in public life. This is contrary to everything our evangelical tradition teaches. It is contrary to the example of the Hebrew prophets who spoke truth to power. It is contrary to the example of our Lord Jesus Christ, who confronted the religious and political authorities of his day, and it is contrary to the example of countless Christian martyrs throughout history who chose to obey God rather than men. As a fellow evangelical Christian, I ask you to speak out against this attack on religious liberty, in a country that is supposed to be America's ally and friend. Senator Banks, your commitment to defending religious freedom has been demonstrated throughout your career in public service. You have received the Family Research Council's True Blue Award for your 100% pro-life, pro-family voting record. You have consistently stood for the rights of believers to live out their faith in the public square without government interference. You have championed the cause of religious liberty, both at home and abroad, understanding that this freedom is the first freedom, the foundation upon which all other freedoms rest. Your record on these issues is not merely a political position. It reflects your deeply held conviction that religious freedom is a God-given right that governments are obligated to protect, not permitted to violate. The situation in South Korea today represents exactly the kind of attack on religious freedom that you have spent your career opposing. President Lee Jae-myung held a press conference on January 21, 2026, just 8 days after Pastor Jun's arrest, in which he made statements that should alarm every defender of religious liberty around the world. He declared that religious involvement in politics is the path to national ruin and that it must be completely uprooted. Consider those words carefully, Senator Banks. The President of South Korea, a constitutional democracy and America's treaty ally, announced publicly that religious citizens who engage in political speech must be completely uprooted. This is not the language of democracy. This is the language of authoritarian regimes that view religion as a threat to state power. President Lee continued his attack on religious freedom with even more alarming rhetoric. He compared religious leaders who engage in political speech to armed rebels committing treason. He said that using the religious system as a political tool is absolutely impermissible, comparing it to giving someone a gun to protect the country only for them to point it at the people. Senator Banks, the president of a democratic nation, America's treaty ally, is comparing pastors who lead peaceful prayer rallies to soldiers who turn their guns on their own people. This is incitement against religious leaders. This is creating a climate in which persecution can be justified as a matter of national security. This is exactly the kind of rhetoric that has preceded systematic religious persecution throughout history, from the Roman Empire to Communist China. President Lee then went further, calling for investigations into Protestant churches as a category. He stated publicly that some Protestant churches should probably be investigated and that the government should naturally proceed with investigations. This is religious targeting of the most blatant kind. The president of a democratic nation is calling for investigations into churches not because of any specific evidence of wrongdoing, but simply because they are Protestant churches that have engaged in political speech. Senator Banks, you have fought throughout your career against government overreach and in defense of religious liberty. What is happening in South Korea is government overreach on a massive scale, directed at an entire religious community. I ask you to bring your voice and your influence to bear against this persecution. Senator Banks, your position as one of President Trump's closest allies in the United States Senate gives you a unique opportunity to make a difference in Pastor Jun's case. You have been described as one of President Trump's closest allies in the Senate, and the President endorsed your Senate campaign. You serve as a vice chair of the National Republican Senatorial Committee alongside Senators Scott, Ricketts, Blackburn, Britt, and Budd, working to cultivate new conservative leaders and assist in their Senate campaigns. Your access to the president and your standing within the Republican Party give you the ability to raise this issue at the highest levels of the American government. Pastor Jeon Kwang-Hoon is one of President Trump's strongest supporters in all of South Korea. His weekly rallies at Gwanghwamun Square consistently celebrated President Trump's approach to North Korea, his commitment to strong alliances, and his America First foreign policy. The participants at these rallies waved American flags alongside Korean flags, expressing their gratitude for the United States and their support for the Trump administration's policies. Pastor Jeon understood that President Trump's approach to the Korean Peninsula, combining maximum pressure on North Korea with direct engagement, offered the best hope for peace and security in the region. He mobilized hundreds of thousands of Koreans to support this approach and to oppose the pro-North Korea policies of the South Korean left. Senator Banks, I respectfully request that you share Pastor Jeon's situation with President Trump directly. The president has shown throughout his career that he values loyalty, and Pastor Jeon has been one of his most loyal supporters in Asia. The president has also shown that he is willing to intervene on behalf of Americans and allies who are unjustly detained abroad. While Pastor Jeon is Korean rather than American, he has been one of the strongest voices for the U.S. Korea alliance and for American values in the entire nation. A word from President Trump expressing concern about Pastor Jeon's treatment could have an enormous impact on the Korean government's calculations. I believe that if the president knew the full story of Pastor Jeon's case, his faithful advocacy for America, and his current suffering in prison, he would want to help. I also ask that you work with your colleagues in the Senate to raise awareness of Pastor Jeon's case and to put pressure on the Korean government to release him. Your positions on the various committees and your relationships with other senators give you the ability to build coalitions and generate attention for issues that matter. A Senate resolution condemning religious persecution in South Korea and calling for Pastor Jeon's release would send a powerful message that the United States Congress is watching, that the treatment of religious leaders matters, and that allies are not exempt from American expectations about human rights. Your leadership in such an effort would be invaluable. Senator Banks, your work in holding China accountable gives you a unique perspective on the strategic dimensions of Pastor Jeon's case. You served on the House Select Committee on China, where you gained deep expertise in the threats that the Chinese Communist Party poses to the United States and its allies. The first bill you introduced in the United States Senate was legislation designating fentanyl as a chemical and biological weapon and sanctioning China for allowing it to flow into America. You understand that China's ambitions extend far beyond its borders, that Beijing seeks to reshape the international order in its image, and that America's allies in the Indo-Pacific are on the front lines of this competition. The Lee Jae-myung administration in South Korea is pursuing policies that align remarkably well with what China would want from a South Korean government. While President Lee speaks of uprooting religious involvement in Korean politics, he has shown a very different attitude toward Beijing. His administration has moved to improve relations with China even as Beijing continues to threaten Taiwan, militarize the South China Sea, and undermine the rules-based international order. The contrast is stark. Korean Christians who support the U.S. alliance are to be investigated and uprooted, while the Chinese Communist Party is to be accommodated and appeased. Pastor Jeon has been the most prominent voice in South Korea opposing what he calls the 5 major policies of the progressive left, each of which would fundamentally undermine the U.S. Korea alliance and serve Chinese interests. First, the abolition of the National Security Act, which has been the foundation of South Korea's defense against North Korean infiltration and espionage since the early days of the Republic. Second, the early transfer of wartime operational control from the combined U.S. Korea command structure to Korean command, without ensuring that Korean forces are fully prepared to assume this responsibility. Third, the potential withdrawal of U.S. forces. Korea, the 28,500 American service members whose presence has deterred North Korean aggression for decades. Fourth, the dissolution of the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command, the institutional embodiment of the alliance that ensures seamless coordination between American and Korean forces in the event of conflict. Fifth, the abolition of the Defense Counterintelligence Command, which would leave South Korea vulnerable to penetration by hostile intelligence services. Together, these 5 policies represent a systematic dismantling of the alliance architecture that has kept the peace in Northeast Asia for 70 years. Senator Banks, you understand better than most how such policies would serve Chinese interests and undermine American security. Pastor Jun's imprisonment is not incidental to this agenda, it is central to it. He has been the biggest obstacle to these policies, which is precisely why he has been targeted. Senator Banks, I am moved to address you also as someone who comes from a working-class background and understands the concerns of ordinary people. You were born and raised in Columbia City, Indiana, the son of a factory worker who worked at Dana Incorporated in Fort Wayne and a nursing home cook. You were the first in your family to go to college, earning your undergraduate degree from Indiana University where you met your wife Amanda, and later completing your Master of Business Administration from Grace College. You understand what it means to work hard, to struggle, to build something from nothing through determination and perseverance. You have not forgotten where you came from, and you continue to fight for working families in Indiana and across America. I too come from humble circumstances, Senator Banks. I work at a senior welfare center in Daejeon, earning a modest salary as I care for the elderly members of my community. I have no political power, no great wealth, no famous name. What I have is a keyboard, an internet connection, and an unshakable conviction that right will ultimately prevail. I have written 24 letters to American leaders, because I believe that somewhere, somehow, one of these letters will reach a person who can make a difference. I am just an ordinary man, but I believe in the power of ordinary people to change the world when they refuse to stay silent in the face of injustice. Pastor Jeon Kwang-Hoon is also, in many ways, an ordinary man who has done extraordinary things. He has spent his life serving God and serving others, not seeking wealth or power but seeking to be faithful to his calling. He rose to prominence not through political connections or family wealth, but through 50 years of faithful ministry and a willingness to speak truth when others remained silent. He organized rallies not because he sought personal glory, but because he believed his country was heading in a dangerous direction and someone needed to sound the alarm. And now he sits in prison, his body failing, abandoned by many who once praised him, paying the price for his faithfulness. Senator Banks, you have shown throughout your career that you listen to ordinary people, that you care about their concerns, and that you are willing to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. The people of Indiana sent you to the Senate because they trusted you to be their voice in Washington. Today I ask you to be a voice for Pastor Jeon, and for the millions of Korean Christians who look to America as a beacon of freedom and a defender of religious liberty. We are ordinary people facing an extraordinary injustice, and we need someone to hear our cry and respond. Allow me to tell you more about the man for whom I plead. Pastor Jeon Kwang-Hoon was born on March 28, 1956, in a Korea that was still recovering from the devastation of war. He grew up in a nation that had been liberated from Japanese colonial rule by American soldiers, defended from communist aggression by American blood, and rebuilt with American aid and friendship. From his earliest days, Pastor Jeon understood that the freedom he enjoyed was not free, that it had been purchased at tremendous cost by those who believed that liberty was worth defending. This understanding shaped his entire life and ministry, just as your own service in Afghanistan was shaped by a similar understanding of freedom's cost and value. Pastor Jeon answered God's call to ministry more than 50 years ago. He has spent his entire adult life preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ, shepherding congregations, and calling his fellow Koreans to lives of faith, integrity, and service. He rose to become the senior pastor of Sarangjel Church, one of the largest and most influential Protestant congregations in Seoul. He served as the president of the Christian Council of Korea, the largest Protestant organization in the nation, representing millions of believers across thousands of churches. He became a voice not just for his own congregation, but for the entire Korean Protestant community, speaking out on matters of faith, morality, and public concern. Beginning in 2019, Pastor Jeon began organizing weekly rallies at Gwanghwamun Square in the heart of Seoul. These gatherings were worship services held in public, where tens of thousands of Koreans came together to sing hymns, to pray, to recite the Lord's Prayer, and to sing the Korean national anthem. They would wave Korean flags alongside American flags, celebrating the alliance between the United States and the Republic of Korea that has been the cornerstone of Korean security and prosperity for 7 decades. Some participants also waved Japanese flags, recognizing the importance of trilateral cooperation in maintaining regional peace. For 7 consecutive years, from 2019 to 2026, Pastor Jeon led these weekly rallies without a single incident of violence. Hundreds of thousands of participants gathered peacefully to worship and to express their patriotism and gratitude. Not one act of aggression was initiated by Pastor Jeon or his followers. Not one. Senator Banks, as a veteran who has seen what real violence looks like in the mountains of Afghanistan, you can surely appreciate the difference between peaceful assembly and armed rebellion. Pastor Jeon led prayer meetings. He organized hymn singing. He encouraged participants to wave flags and express their love for their country and its allies. This is not insurrection. This is not rebellion. This is the peaceful exercise of rights that are supposed to be protected in any democracy. Yet the Korean government has imprisoned this 69-year-old pastor, comparing him to armed rebels and threatening to uproot all religious involvement in political life. The injustice is breathtaking, and someone needs to speak out against it. Yet despite this record of peaceful advocacy, Pastor Jeon has been relentlessly persecuted by successive leftist governments in South Korea. Under the administration of President Moon Jae-in, which governed from 2017 to 2022, Pastor Jeon was arrested and imprisoned 3 separate times. He was charged with an astonishing 76 criminal offenses ranging from election law violations to public safety infractions. The cases dragged on for years, consuming his time, his resources, and his energy. And in the end, after all the investigations, all the trials, and all the appeals, Pastor Jeon was found not guilty on every single charge. All 76 accusations were dismissed by the courts as politically motivated, lacking in evidence, and fundamentally unjust. This pattern of persecution has now resumed with even greater intensity under the administration of President Lee Jae-myung. On January 13, 2026, Pastor Jeon was arrested yet again. The original charges of incitement to insurrection were sensational and alarming, designed to paint Pastor Jeon as a dangerous radical seeking to overthrow the government. But these charges quickly collapsed under scrutiny. There was no evidence of any plan to overthrow the government. There was no evidence of any violent conspiracy. There was no evidence of anything beyond a 69-year-old pastor exercising his constitutional right to speak freely about matters of public concern. The selective nature of his prosecution is evident from the fact that the Supreme Prosecutor's Office initially rejected arrest warrants for both Pastor Jeon and another leader, Representative Shin Hae-sik, due to insufficient evidence. It was only after political pressure from the highest levels of the Lee administration that the warrant for Pastor Jeon alone was approved, while Representative Shin remained free. This selective prosecution demonstrates that the case against Pastor Jeon is not about enforcing the law fairly, but about silencing a prominent voice that opposes the government's agenda. The judge presiding over Pastor Jeon's case, Judge Park Ji-won, openly criticized the prosecution on February 27, 2026, stating that the charges were unclear, that specific perpetrators had not been identified, and that the prosecution had failed to establish how Pastor Jeon's words led to any specific illegal acts. The judge told the prosecution, in open court, that they should reconsider their indictment, yet still Pastor Jeon remains in prison. Senator Banks, you have built your career on principles of fairness, justice, and the rule of law. What is happening to Pastor Jeon is a mockery of all these principles. He is being held in prison despite a judge's criticism of the charges, despite the selective nature of the prosecution, and despite his complete record of nonviolent advocacy. This is not justice. This is political persecution dressed up in legal robes. And it is happening in a country that is supposed to share America's commitment to freedom, democracy, and the rule of law. Senator Banks, I must now speak to you about a matter of urgent and grave concern. Pastor Jeon Kwang-Hoon is dying. His health conditions were already serious before his imprisonment, but 73 days of incarceration have accelerated his decline to a critical point. His defense attorneys have filed for bail, presenting detailed medical evidence of his deteriorating condition. Yet the court continues to delay its decision, leaving Pastor Jeon to suffer in detention while his body fails. If action is not taken soon, Pastor Jeon may not survive to see his vindication in court. The next hearing is scheduled for April 17, 2026, still weeks away. There is a real possibility that he will not live to see that date if he remains in detention. Pastor Jeon suffers from a serious spinal condition called OPLL, which stands for ossification of the posterior longitudinal ligament. This is a progressive disease in which the ligament that runs along the back of the spine gradually turns to bone, compressing the spinal cord and causing neurological symptoms. Pastor Jeon has undergone 3 separate cervical spine surgeries to address this condition. His defense attorneys stated in their bail application that the defendant has undergone 3 surgeries and has 3 metal rods implanted in his neck. This condition requires ongoing monitoring by specialists, access to advanced medical facilities, and careful management to prevent catastrophic complications. The stress and inadequate care of prison are exactly what his doctors would warn against. In addition to his spinal condition, Pastor Jeon suffers from long-term diabetes with multiple serious complications, as well as hypothyroidism requiring ongoing medication. Most critically, his defense attorneys have revealed that Pastor Jeon has lost bladder function entirely. They stated that he must forcibly expel urine multiple times a day using a drainage device because his bladder can no longer function on its own. Senator Banks, I must be direct with you. Pastor Jeon now requires mechanical assistance to perform basic bodily functions. A tube or device must be used multiple times daily to drain his bladder because his body can no longer do this naturally. This is not a minor inconvenience, this is a serious medical condition that requires proper care and monitoring. The defense attorneys further stated that Pastor Jeon suffers from severe mobility impairment to the point that his spouse must feed him his meals directly. Think about that for a moment, Senator Banks. A 69-year-old pastor, the former president of the largest Protestant organization in Korea, a man who organized rallies attended by hundreds of thousands, now cannot feed himself without assistance from his wife. He cannot walk properly. He cannot urinate without mechanical assistance. And yet the court continues to delay its decision on bail, leaving him to deteriorate further in detention. His attorneys have applied for bail, presenting all of this medical evidence, but the court keeps postponing its ruling. This is not justice. This is cruelty. Senator Banks, I must now tell you about the man who is responsible for Pastor Jeon's imprisonment, and who poses a direct threat to the values that the United States and South Korea are supposed to share. President Lee Jae-myung took office in 2025 after a tumultuous political period that saw the impeachment of President Yoon Suk-yeol. Lee represents the progressive left wing of Korean politics, a movement that has historically been skeptical of the U.S. Korea alliance, sympathetic to engagement with North Korea and China, and hostile to the influence of Protestant Christianity in Korean public life. His presidency represents a fundamental challenge to the democratic values and alliance commitments that have defined South Korea for decades. On January 21, 2026, just 8 days after Pastor Jeon's arrest, President Lee held his New Year press conference. His statements about religion should alarm every defender of religious freedom around the world. President Lee declared that religious involvement in politics is the path to national ruin and that it must be completely uprooted. Senator Banks, as a born-again evangelical Christian who has built your career on defending religious freedom, consider those words carefully. The President of South Korea, a constitutional democracy and America's treaty ally, announced publicly that religious citizens who engage in political speech must be completely uprooted. This is not the language of democracy. This is the language of authoritarian regimes that view religion as a threat to state power. This is the language of the Chinese Communist Party, which you have spent so much of your career opposing. President Lee continued his attack on religious freedom with increasingly alarming rhetoric. He compared religious leaders who engage in political speech to armed rebels committing treason. He said that using the religious system as a political tool is absolutely impermissible, comparing it to giving someone a gun to protect the country only for them to point it at the people. Senator Banks, you served in Afghanistan carrying a weapon to defend your country. You understand the difference between a soldier defending freedom and a rebel attacking it. President Lee is comparing pastors who lead peaceful prayer rallies to soldiers who turn their guns on their own people. This is incitement against religious leaders. This is creating a climate in which persecution can be justified as a matter of national security. This is exactly the kind of rhetoric that precedes systematic religious persecution. President Lee then went further, calling for investigations into Protestant churches as a category. He stated publicly that some Protestant churches should probably be investigated and that the government should naturally proceed with investigations. This is religious targeting of the most blatant kind. The president of a democratic nation, America's treaty ally, is calling for investigations into churches not because of any specific evidence of wrongdoing, but simply because they are Protestant churches that have engaged in political speech. Senator Banks, this is the kind of religious persecution that America should be speaking out against, not ignoring because it happens in an allied country. President Lee's most chilling statement reveals the strategic nature of his attack on religious freedom. He used an agricultural metaphor that exposes his true intentions. He said that when plowing a field, you remove the big stones first, then the small ones. Senator Banks, Pastor Jeon Kwang-Hoon is the big stone. He is the most prominent Protestant leader in South Korea, the former president of the Christian Council of Korea, the organizer of the largest pro-American rallies in the nation. By imprisoning him first, the Lee administration is sending a message to every other religious leader: speak out, and you will be next. This is not law enforcement. This is systematic intimidation of an entire religious community. The pattern of tyranny extends beyond rhetoric to concrete policy. The Lee administration is pursuing what Pastor Jeon has called the 5 major policies, each of which would fundamentally undermine the U.S. Korea alliance and serve Chinese interests. First, the abolition of the National Security Act, which has been the foundation of South Korea's defense against North Korean infiltration and espionage since the early days of the Republic. Second, the early transfer of wartime operational control from the combined U.S. Korea command structure to Korean command, without ensuring that Korean forces are fully prepared to assume this responsibility. Third, the potential withdrawal of U.S. forces Korea, the 28,500 American service members whose presence has deterred North Korean aggression for decades. Fourth, the dissolution of the ROK U.S. Combined Forces Command, the institutional embodiment of the alliance that ensures seamless coordination between American and Korean forces in the event of conflict. Fifth, the abolition of the Defense Counterintelligence Command, which would leave South Korea vulnerable to penetration by hostile intelligence services. Together, these 5 policies represent a systematic dismantling of the alliance architecture that has kept the peace in Northeast Asia for 70 years, and Pastor Jeon has been the most prominent voice opposing these policies, which is precisely why he has been targeted. The big stone must be removed first so that the smaller stones can be dealt with one by one. Senator Banks, as someone who has made holding China accountable a central focus of your work, You understand how these policies would serve Beijing's interests. China wants to weaken the U.S. Korea alliance. China wants American forces off the Korean peninsula. China wants to penetrate South Korean institutions with intelligence operations. The Lee administration is pursuing policies that would give China everything it wants, and it is silencing the most prominent voice opposing these policies. Whether this alignment is intentional or merely coincidental, the effect is the same. America's interests are being undermined, and America's ally is persecuting a pastor who has spent 7 years defending those interests. Senator Banks, I come to you not merely with a problem but with specific requests for action. You have built your career on getting things done, on fighting for your constituents and your values, on making a difference in the lives of ordinary people. I ask you to bring those same qualities to bear on behalf of Pastor Jeon Kwang-Hoon and the cause of religious freedom in South Korea. The following steps are within your power, and each would make a meaningful difference. First, I request that you issue a public statement expressing concern about religious persecution in South Korea and calling for Pastor Jeon's release. Your voice carries weight because you are known as a strong defender of religious freedom and as one of President Trump's closest allies. A statement from Senator Jim Banks expressing concern about the treatment of a pro-American pastor in South Korea would resonate both in Washington and in Seoul. It would let the Korean government know that the international community is watching, and it would give hope to Korean Christians who feel that they have been abandoned by the country they have long admired and supported. Second, I request that you share Pastor Jeon's situation directly with President Trump. You have access to the president that few others possess, and Pastor Jeon has been one of President Trump's strongest supporters in Asia. The president values loyalty, and he has shown willingness to intervene on behalf of those who have supported him and American interests. I believe that if President Trump knew the full story of Pastor Jeon's case, his years of organizing pro-American rallies, his current suffering in prison with a catheter and inability to walk, he would want to help. A word from the president expressing concern could change everything. Third, I request that you discuss this matter with Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who shares your commitment to religious freedom and your understanding of authoritarian persecution. Secretary Rubio has been a champion of religious liberty throughout his career, and he understands the importance of America speaking out against persecution wherever it occurs. The State Department has tools and mechanisms for addressing religious freedom violations, and Secretary Rubio's engagement could make a significant difference. Fourth, I request that you work with your colleagues to consider a Senate resolution condemning religious persecution in South Korea and calling for Pastor Jeon's release. Such a resolution would be a powerful statement of American values and would put the Korean government on notice that its behavior is unacceptable. Your relationships with other senators and your leadership positions give you the ability to build coalitions for such an effort. Fifth, I request that you raise questions about religious freedom in South Korea through appropriate channels, asking what the State Department is doing to address this situation and whether the United States has communicated concerns to the Korean government. And sixth, I humbly request that if possible, you might help facilitate an opportunity for me to brief members of Congress or the State Department directly on the situation in Korea. Senator Banks, I close this letter with a personal appeal from one believer to another, from one soldier of freedom to another, from one ordinary person who believes in the power of faith and freedom to transform the world. You have built your life and career on the conviction that Jesus Christ is Lord, that freedom is worth defending, and that ordinary people can make an extraordinary difference when they refuse to stay silent. I share those convictions, and I believe that this moment calls us to act on them. The Bible teaches us in the book of Proverbs, chapter 31, verses 8 and 9, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly, defend the rights of the poor and needy. Pastor Jeon cannot speak for himself from his prison cell. He lies there unable to urinate without mechanical assistance, unable to walk without help, unable to feed himself without his wife's care. But you can speak for him. You have the voice, the platform, and the position to make a difference. The Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, verse 36, records the words of Jesus: "I was in prison and you came to visit me." And when the righteous ask when they saw the Lord in prison, he answers, "Whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me." Pastor Jeon is in prison for his faith and for his defense of the alliance between our nations. He is suffering for values that you and I share. Speaking for him, fighting for his release, this is the work of faith put into action. This is what it means to be a doer of the word and not merely a hearer. You were the first in your family to go to college, Senator Banks. You came from a working-class family in Columbia City, the son of a factory worker and a nursing home cook. You built your career through hard work, determination, and faith. You deployed to Afghanistan when your country called, leaving behind everything familiar to serve in a dangerous land. You understand what it means to sacrifice, what it means to fight for something larger than yourself, what it means to answer a calling. I ask you to answer this calling now. Pastor Jeon Kwang-Hoon needs your voice. The cause of religious freedom needs your voice. The U.S. Korea Alliance needs your voice. And the millions of Korean Christians who are watching to see whether America will stand with them need to know that they have not been abandoned. Thank you, Senator Banks, for taking the time to read this letter. I know that you receive countless communications from constituents and advocates, and I am grateful that you have given this appeal your attention. I pray that God will guide your decisions and that He will use you as an instrument of justice and mercy in this situation. You have 3 daughters, Lillian, Elizabeth, and Joanne. I pray that they will grow up in a world where religious freedom is protected, and where leaders like you are willing to speak out against persecution wherever it occurs. Pastor Jeon, in his prison letter, reminded his followers of President Syngman Rhee's rallying cry: "Unite, fight, win." These words sustained the Korean people through the darkest days of their history. They can sustain us now. I ask you to unite with us in this cause, to fight for religious freedom and the rule of law, and to help us win the release of Pastor Jeon Kwang-Hoon before it is too late. The court has delayed its decision on bail despite all the medical evidence. The government continues to hold him despite a judge's criticism of the charges. Time is running out. Pastor Jeon may not survive much longer in his current condition. I pray for Pastor Jeon, that God will sustain his failing body, strengthen his unbroken spirit, and bring about his swift release. I pray for the people of South Korea, that they will find the courage to resist the forces of tyranny, and to defend the freedoms that so many sacrificed to secure. I pray for the United States and South Korea together, that the alliance forged in shared sacrifice and sustained by shared values, will endure this test and emerge stronger than before. And I pray for you, Senator Banks, that you will be blessed in your service to Indiana and to the nation, that your wife Amanda and your daughters will prosper, and that you will always have the courage to speak truth, to defend freedom, and to stand with the persecuted. You deployed to Afghanistan as a soldier of freedom. I ask you now to deploy your voice, your influence, and your faith on behalf of another soldier of freedom, who is fighting the battle of his life in a prison cell in South Korea. With deepest respect and urgent hope, I remain your humble servant in Christ, Kim Sun-gi.